Dan Hampton is a New York Times bestselling author, has taken a look at the flight from the eyes of a pilot in a new book called The Flight, Charles Lindbergh's Daring and Immortal 1927 Transatlantic Crossing. Dan Hampton, welcome to Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me.
It took Charles Lindbergh 33 hours. How long did it take you to make that flight?
Well, I used to do it a little quicker, but I was in a jet, so that doesn't really count now, does it?
No. But how long would it take you to go, or how fast can we do it today if we had to?
Well, we could do it very, very fast. The problem is you run out of gas when you go very, very fast, so you have to fly at the speed of the people that are passing you the gas. He didn't have the option of doing that, obviously. There was no air refueling back then, so he had to conserve fuel and go relatively slow. Dan,
I thought there was everything that was ever known about Charles Lindbergh and the flight was already out there. What new did you find out?
Well, as you alluded to, I wrote it from the standpoint of a pilot. So you're right. There's a voluminous information about his life, about his later life, his early life. Very little about his actual physical flight. And I figured, well, having been a pilot, having seen the same places myself, been over them myself, I know what he felt like in most of the situations he got. And I'm going to write this from the position of the pilot in the cockpit and therefore put the reader in the cockpit with him.
And so it's amazing how much, even you mentioned Scott Berg's book, which won the Pulitzer, I believe, for Lindbergh, spent so few pages on the actual flight itself.
Well, I think for the type of book he was writing, and it's a superb book, by the way, probably the seminal work on Lindbergh, he was more interested in the man and what made him tick and how he grew up and why he grew up the way he did and then what happened to him, later in life. The flight indeed made him famous, but Berg was concentrating on other areas.
Dan Hampton, the book is called The Flight. Everyone knows Charles Lindbergh now, but others tried before him, and they lost their lives. So what was it about Lindbergh that he was able to do it where the others before him, the unknown Charles Lindbergh, was able to do it where the other more known pilots of the day failed?
Well, Lindbergh went very small scale, and he went very, sleek and streamlined. He went with a smaller airplane designed for only that purpose, to get himself across the Atlantic. It was basically a flying gas can. And he went single. He went solo. Everybody else tried it with a big multi-engine airplane and a crew, and he decided, hey, I've got a better chance of doing this if I go alone and I go small, and that's what he did.
Is it because, Dan, he figured out that it was all about weight?
Well, yes and no. I mean, a pilot, having another pilot or a navigator along would mean 180 pounds or so of fuel that he could carry. But I think, and I sympathize with him here. Like me, I was a single-seat, single-engine kind of guy, and he was too at heart. And there's something to be said for that mentality. You know that if you don't do it, it isn't going to get done. You don't have anybody to depend on but yourself, and that plays a big part in success.
How much gas did he have when he finally landed?
He had about 88 gallons left, I think. And he could have flown probably another 800,000 miles on that. So he had enough fuel. The guys in New York actually crammed an extra 25 gallons in before he took off, so he had a little bit more than he'd planned on.
Did he know he had plenty of gas, or was he worried about running out of gas?
Well, a pilot rarely knows he has enough gas, at least back then. He didn't even have a fuel gauge. He was doing it all based on engine setting and what his consumption was and then how long he was flying.
Wow. How I'm assuming you made those flights numerous times, even in at least, a moment or two, you had to think what he thought about making that same flight.
Oh, yeah. One time we took off from the East Coast to go to the Middle East for yet another, reason. And we were over the North Atlantic in a thunderstorm for probably 5-6 hours. And that is a truly frightening experience. Any pilot will tell you. And I did think, because I knew Lindbergh had run into a thunderstorm over the Atlantic, how lonely he must have felt by himself in a little fabric-covered airplane at 100 miles an hour down there, when I felt pretty bad up in my jet fighter.
Yeah. They say, Dan Hampton, the author of the book The Flight, that sometimes he flew very close to the water, and other times he flew high. Why did he do that, and did he do that?
Yeah, he did do that. He liked to get down close to the water because it helped him stay awake. He had to concentrate a little bit more. He could see the water. Pilots like to see things, and after hours and hours of flying inside the clouds, if he could get down and see the water, he would. When he got up higher, though, a couple of times he ran into ice. And ice is bad in any aircraft. It's especially bad in an airplane with a carburetor and a propeller. And so he would descend down to a lower altitude to get to a little bit warmer air. He got down so low sometimes the salt spray was blowing into his cockpit.
I mean, really, that's how low he got.
That's how low he got.
I mean, that's really. That's real.
Well, yeah, and it occurred to him with 50-foot waves underneath him that probably wasn't a good idea, so he quickly climbed back up.
All right, good. He kept meticulous notes, did he not?
He did, absolutely.
And that's what helped you write the book?
Yeah, that helped me quite a bit. He actually wrote quite a bit down that wasn't published until after he was dead. I spent some time out there in your fabulous Missouri Historical Society Museum. I was allowed to poke through all of his stuff, also the Yale Library where more of his papers are kept. I talked to his daughter a few times, and the son of the man that helped him design the airplane. So I had a lot of information.
Well, because he bought the engine from the company in San Diego, right?
He bought the plane in San Diego. The engine was a Wright Whirlwind. It came from New Jersey.
New Jersey. What was it? Was it the genius of the plane or the engine or Lindbergh, or was it just a sort of moment in time where they all came together?
I think they all came together. Lindbergh was, unlike a lot of other famous pilots then, Lindbergh was a natural flyer. He was a very good flyer, and he was technical and meticulous and prepared. He also had the benefit of a very well-designed airplane and a first-class engine. You couldn't ask for a better engine than what he had.
Why was it called the Spirit of St. Louis?
Because exactly where you are. his backers. He was flying the airmail out of Lambert Field, and when he got the idea to compete for the Orteig Prize, he got some local friends and backers and businessmen, and for tribute to them, he called it the Spirit of St. Louis.
So that's really the first. Well, first of all, the rumors around town is that the Noonday Club, where he raised the money from, they were like, no, don't put the Spirit of St. Louis on there. Don't worry about it, right? I mean, they sort of tried to talk him out of it? I
never heard that story. I think they were, at least his original, half a dozen or so backers were pretty flattered by it.
Okay.
I never heard that story. It's possible. It's true.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the day he took off. Mitchell Field in Long Island, where there are now baseball fields. Where growing up as a kid, I played baseball, and there were some hangars that were still there. Where every time I played baseball, I was like, "Man, the guy took off from right here. Does anybody care?" And people were like, "Shut up and throw me the ball." But is it true? My grandmother told me stories that they were afraid he wasn't even going to be able to get off the ground.
Well, yeah, it was actually Roosevelt Field. They're all there together. They were all part of an original airfield. And when we say airfield, today we think, airfield, airport. It literally was, as you know, just a big, huge field, cut up into several pieces. One of them was named Roosevelt. That's where he took off from. It's now the parking lot of the Garden City Mall. Yeah. And to answer your question, yeah, they were a little bit worried about it because he'd done all the flight testing and numbers for this airplane out in California, and there's a big difference between the weather in California and the weather in New York. And it was wet. The field was wet. He was taken off on a little packed cinder. They called it a runway, but it would appall you and I. It looked more like a golf cart track, really. And it was wet and soggy, and his wheels were sinking into this thing, and he was a little bit heavier than he'd planned on. But that wonderful movie that Jimmy Stewart made, and it was accurate in a lot of ways, but they kind of took some liberties with that takeoff scene because he really didn't clip the trees like that.
All right, fair enough. Now, also in that movie, Jimmy Stewart's fallen asleep 3/4 of the way through the flight. How did he stay awake for 33 and a half hours?
With great difficulty. He didn't sleep for at least a day prior. And he'd gone to New York to see a show before the takeoff and then decided at the last minute, hey, we can go, the weather's clearing. And as you mentioned, there were other pilots waiting to go, so he wanted to beat him to the punch. Adrenaline helped for a while, but somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, especially at night before the storms hit, he had trouble staying awake. So he kept the windows out. The plane was very hard to fly. I can attest to that. It flies kind of like a washing machine. But he did that on purpose. He wanted it to be something that he had to constantly fly because he thought it helped keep him awake.
Dan Hampton, New York Times best-selling author, has written a new book about Charles Lindbergh. It's called The Flight, getting a lot of attention. Dan, let's talk about the route for a second, because in 1927, he couldn't check his GPS on his phone. So how did the man navigate from Roosevelt Field in New York to a suburb in Paris?
Well, it's called Dead Reckoning, and what he did was he laid out these, actually on the coast of the United States, and then once he was in France, he used road maps. He used 4 Rand McNally maps to cover New York to the edge of Massachusetts. And then over the water, he had they're called Mercator projections, and they're big, huge maps that boats used at the time, to plot courses. And that's what he did. He plotted a course and then had to correct for winds in flight to hold that course. And he figured, rightly so, that if he flew east long enough, he would hit Europe. He just didn't know whether it would be Norway or Spain, And he was extremely fortunate and very surprised that he hit Ireland very close to where he had planned to hit Ireland. Did
he have to land in Paris? Could he have landed in London? Could he have landed in Germany and have still won the prize?
He had to get to at least Paris. The prize was from New York to Paris or Paris to New York, but he actually toyed with the idea of, hey, now that I've made it, flying on to Rome. Surely if I fly on to Rome, I will have proven that, I could have landed in Paris. And then he decided against it. He didn't want to take any more risks, and he was thinking about the prize, as you mentioned. The prize specifically says between those two cities. And he wanted to pay his investors back, so he needed the money.
Dan, the book is called The Flight. Just a couple minutes left. I'm sure it's a minute-by-minute account. I'm sure it's a fantastic book. Thank you for spending a couple minutes with us. So when he lands in, is it Bourget in Paris, right? Right outside
of Paris? Yeah, Le Bourget.
He's mobbed by tens of thousands of people who are coming to greet him and get a piece of the plane and everything. Again, there is no Google, so how do they know he lands successfully?
Well, he didn't know it either, but he was being followed, at the different pieces of land that he crossed, like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and then Ireland. People would see him, and they would call into the local, radio station, and then the radio folks would convey it back down the line to New York or up ahead to Paris and London. So he had no idea that people were following the way that they were, and he did not certainly expect 100,000 screaming, hysterical Frenchmen in Paris.
Did they destroy the plane, or did they?
No, they just banged it up a little bit. And actually most of the damage was done when the authorities took it's called a barograph, and think of it like a flight recorder, a primitive one, to show that he had, in fact, flown nonstop and hadn't landed anywhere. And they did a lot of the damage when they pulled that thing out. There were some missing pieces and parts, and most important to him was his flight log. Somebody took his flight log, and that's never been found to this day.
So, and what does the flight log have in it?
Well, it had his personal notes, whatever they were, and some of the flight data. He also wrote a lot of that data on another piece of paper and scratched his fuel consumption numbers up on the plywood windshield, windshield instrument panel.
Okay. And so no one's ever been able to find the log? And it's never come up at auction anywhere? Yeah, interesting. Dan Hampton, the book is called The Flight. If you, being a pilot, if you could ask Charles Lindbergh any question, what would you ask him?
Why did you really do this?
Really?
Yeah. I think his answer would be that he did it to show that commercial aviation was truly a possibility, and it would work. And I guess I would lead into it by saying, look, if you knew everything that was going to happen to you later in life, would you have done this flight anyway? If you'd known your little boy was going to be kidnapped, if you knew, that you were going to invoke the wrath of a president and suffer, the vagaries of public opinion as you did later in life, would you have done it anyway?
Right. They also say, Dan Hampton, that he was sort of quietly helped pilots in the Pacific. Did he not during World War II?
Absolutely. One of the big myths that I dispelled, because everyone was uptight over him over his America First, involvement. He actually went out and flew 50 combat missions against the Japanese because, as he said, it's my country. I love it. It's been attacked. I want to go fight.
Yeah. The book is called The Flight, Charles Lindbergh's Daring and Immortal 1927 Transatlantic Crossing. Dan Hampton, New York Times bestselling author. Good luck with the book. Thanks for spending a couple minutes with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You got it. Dan Hampton. The book is The Flight. And anything Charles Lindbergh, man, is just, right? I mean, he was the Tom Brady of his day, minus the devil part. He was as big got. He was the first, right? He was the first Frank Sinatra, the first Beatles. He was the first celebrity. He was as big got right after he landed in Paris, which was 90 years ago yesterday. The book is The Flight. We'll come back. Take phone calls. 314-969-KTRS, 1-888-550-KTRS, or star KTRS. Those are the phone numbers. Let me talk to you about Gelmish & Sons, because maybe